There is a moment, maybe it already happened to you this morning, when you're sitting somewhere quiet, coffee going cold in your hand, and out of nowhere, something in you softens. Not sadness, exactly. Something gentler than that, something without a clear name. You look at the light coming through the window, the way it lands on the edge of the table, and for a second, you're not thinking about your knees or your appointments or what you forgot at the store. You're just here. Fully here in a way you weren't at 30 or 40 or even 60. And maybe a small voice inside you whispers, when did I start noticing things like this? When did an ordinary morning start feeling like this much? That moment, that quiet, almost accidental noticing is not confusion. It is not your mind slowing down in a way that should worry you. It is one of the strangest, most tender gifts of growing older, and almost nobody prepares you for it, because nobody warns you that getting older might mean feeling more, not less. You were told, probably by well-meaning people, to expect the losses, the aches, the slower steps, the friends who move away or move on. You were rarely told to expect this. A kind of quiet widening, a sense that the world has somehow gotten more detailed, more textured, more worth paying attention to than it ever was when you technically had more energy to pay attention with. If you felt that and wondered what to make of it, you're not imagining it, and you're certainly not alone in it. Today, we're going to talk honestly about why life after 70 feels so different. Not in the way people warn you about, not in the language of loss and decline you hear so often, but in ways almost nobody says out loud. We're going to walk through 9 specific shifts that happen quietly, underneath the surface of getting older, shifts in how you experience time, how you carry yourself around others, what actually catches your attention now, what you've learned to value, and who you've become underneath all of it. Some of these might sound familiar the moment I say them, like I've been reading your own mind. Others might put language to something you've felt for years but never quite had the words for. By the end of this, I hope you see your own life a little differently. Not as something winding down, but as something that is, for the first time in a long time, finally coming into focus. None of this is meant to gloss over the parts of aging that are genuinely hard, because there are hard parts, and pretending otherwise wouldn't honor what you've actually lived through. But sitting right alongside the hard parts, quietly, patiently, there are these 9 gifts too, and they deserve just as much of your attention as the difficulties do, maybe more, because almost nobody ever takes the time to point them out to you. Let's start with the one almost everyone feels but rarely names out loud. Reason number 1. Time itself feels different now. Think back to the last ordinary Tuesday you had. Nothing special happened. No birthday, no holiday, nothing marked on the calendar. Nothing you'd tell anyone about later. And yet, by evening, you found yourself unusually aware of it. The way the afternoon light moved slowly across the wall. The sound of a neighbor's lawnmower drifting in through an open window. The particular taste of your tea, still warm in your hands. Why does a completely unremarkable day suddenly feel worth noticing, worth almost holding on to? Here is what's actually happening underneath that feeling. When you were younger, time felt infinite in a very specific, unspoken way. Not because you consciously believed you'd live forever, but because your mind simply didn't need to ration it. You had decades stretching out ahead of you, so any given today didn't need to matter on its own terms. It was just one interchangeable unit in a very long line of units, easily traded for tomorrow or the next day or the one after that. But somewhere along the way, sometimes gradually, sometimes after a specific loss or diagnosis or milestone, something shifts. You stop experiencing time as an unlimited resource, and you start experiencing it as something finite. And here is the part almost nobody expects. That shift doesn't make time feel smaller. It makes it feel more vivid. Psychologists who study how people respond to an awareness of limited time have found something consistent and almost counterintuitive. When people become genuinely aware their time is limited, they don't shut down emotionally, they don't stop caring. They actually open up. They pay closer attention to what's directly in front of them. They invest more meaning into small, ordinary moments because those moments are no longer small and interchangeable. They're numbered, and numbered things get noticed. This is not decline. This is not your attention breaking down. This is your mind doing something remarkably intelligent, something it couldn't fully do when you were younger. Reallocating your attention toward what's actually real and present, instead of what might happen someday, in some vague and distant future that no longer feels quite as certain, or quite as important, as the cup of tea in your hands right now. A 25-year-old can afford to daydream through an entire afternoon without noticing a single detail of it, because there will always be another afternoon. You, in a strange and quietly beautiful way, no longer take that for granted, and so you don't drift through your days the way you used to. You're here, in this exact moment, tasting this exact cup of tea, in a way your younger self simply never learned how to do, because your younger self never had the reason to learn it. Consider something as simple as a family gathering. 15 or 20 years ago, you might have spent half of it thinking about the dishes still waiting in the sink, or the drive home, or a worry from work trailing behind you into the evening. Today, you notice the exact sound of a grandchild's laugh, the particular way the late light catches the tablecloth, the simple fact that everyone you love happens to be in the same room at the same time. Gratitude researchers have long pointed out that appreciation and attention are close cousins. You cannot fully appreciate what you don't fully notice in the first place, and noticing, almost without your choosing it, has quietly become one of your specialties now, in a way it simply wasn't before. That heaviness you sometimes feel when a day feels almost too aware, too noticed, too full of small details, that's not anxiety creeping back in. That's presence, arriving late but finally, fully arriving. And once you start seeing it that way, the whole shape of your days begins to change. You stop waiting for the big, marked occasions to feel something worth remembering. You start finding that feeling in the plain, unmarked ones instead. A Tuesday, a Wednesday afternoon, an ordinary phone call. And that, more than almost anything else, is what people mean when they say someone in their 70s or 80s seems to be really, truly living. Not because their life got bigger or busier or more eventful. Because their attention finally did. Now, if that first shift was about time, the second one follows right behind it, almost like its quieter, more surprising twin. Reason number 2. You stop performing for other people. Have you noticed that you care less than you used to about what the neighbors think of your garden? Or whether your outfit matches? Or whether someone at the pharmacy is quietly judging what's in your cart? Maybe you've caught yourself saying something blunt in a conversation lately and thought, 10 years ago I never would have said that out loud, not like that, not so plainly. This isn't you becoming careless or difficult or somehow rougher around the edges than you used to be. It's something far more interesting happening underneath the surface. For most of your adult life, a genuinely enormous amount of your mental and emotional energy went toward managing how you were perceived. As a parent, as an employee, as a spouse, as a neighbor, as a member of a community full of watching eyes and unspoken expectations. That management wasn't a personal flaw. It's simply how social survival tends to work through most of adulthood, when your reputation, your relationships, and your livelihood are all still actively being built and protected. But that machinery runs on a particular kind of fuel, the belief that other people's opinions will meaningfully shape your future. And here is the quiet truth about growing older that almost nobody says plainly. That belief starts to loosen gradually, steadily, because it's simply true less often than it used to be. You're not chasing a promotion anymore. You're not trying to win over a difficult boss, or impress a distant relative, or prove yourself to anyone auditioning you for anything. The audience that once felt so enormously important has, one person and one situation at a time, quietly stepped off the stage of your life. And what's left standing there, once the audience has gone, is simply you. At first, for some people, that can feel like a kind of loss, especially for anyone whose sense of identity was built almost entirely around roles and titles and other people's approval. But for many others, something unexpected and quietly wonderful happens instead. Relief. A kind of long, slow exhale that's been 40 or 50 years in the making. You start saying what you actually think instead of the version that sounds acceptable. You wear the sweater you genuinely like, not the one that photographs well for someone else's benefit. You stop finishing your sentences the way you think they're supposed to end, and start finishing them the way you actually mean them. People sometimes describe this shift as not caring anymore, as though it were a kind of withdrawal from the world, a loss of engagement. It isn't that at all. It's closer to the opposite. It's caring for what might be the first time in decades about the right things. Think about how you dress now compared to how you dressed at 45, when there was a certain outfit for the office, a certain outfit for church, a certain outfit for a neighbor's dinner party, each one carefully chosen to send exactly the right signal to exactly the right audience. Now, maybe you wear the same comfortable cardigan 3 days in a row because it feels good against your skin, and the thought of what the mail carrier might think of it simply never crosses your mind. That's not carelessness. That's decades of unnecessary mental labor finally, quietly being set down, freeing up space for things that actually deserve your attention. That bluntness people sometimes half apologize for in themselves. That's not you becoming harder. That's you finally becoming honest. And once that honesty settles into you, it tends to stay for good. Not because you've given up on connection with other people, but because you've finally stopped editing yourself in order to keep that connection. The performance ends, quietly, without ceremony. And the person who was underneath it the whole time, the one who's been there since long before the performance ever started, finally gets to hold the microphone. From there, something else tends to follow almost automatically, and it might be the shift people around you notice about you before you fully notice it yourself. Reason number 3. Small things start to feel bigger. Has this happened to you? You take a sip of coffee on a completely ordinary morning, and for just a second, it tastes almost unreasonably good, almost worth commenting on out loud even though nothing about it has actually changed. Or a grandchild calls just to talk. No occasion at all. Nothing they need from you, and you find yourself unexpectedly moved by it, more than the moment probably deserves on paper. There's a real, well-studied psychological reason small pleasures start hitting differently later in life, and it has quite a lot to do with contrast. When you were younger, your days were often stacked high with big, attention-grabbing events. New jobs, new homes, relationships forming and sometimes ending, children moving through one dramatic stage after another. Against that loud, crowded backdrop, small pleasures got drowned out almost entirely. A genuinely good cup of coffee simply couldn't compete for your attention against a promotion, or a wedding, or a move across the country. But as the big, loud events naturally become less frequent with age, your capacity for emotional sensitivity doesn't disappear along with them. It simply, finally, has more room to notice what was quietly there the entire time. It's a bit like stepping out of a noisy, crowded room into a still, quiet one. Sounds you genuinely couldn't hear a moment ago suddenly become clear and distinct. Researchers who study aging and emotion have given this a name, savoring, and they found again and again that older adults are often measurably better at it than younger people are, better at staying with a good moment instead of rushing straight past it toward whatever comes next. Younger minds are frequently future-oriented by necessity, constantly scanning ahead for what's coming, what needs planning, what needs securing. Older minds, especially past 70, tend to shift naturally toward being present-oriented instead, and presence, as it turns out, is exactly the soil that savoring needs in order to grow. So when a phone call from a grandchild moves you more than it should, or an ordinary sunset stops you in your tracks in a way it never used to, that's not sentimentality creeping in with age. That's your nervous system, after decades of quiet practice, finally getting genuinely good at the one thing that makes a life feel worth living in the first place. Noticing it fully while it's actually happening. It might show up in something as small as the specific slant of light through your kitchen window at 7 in the morning, or the particular way your dog settles at your feet, or a handwritten note from a grandchild whose spelling isn't quite right yet, taped to your refrigerator door. None of these things would have registered as significant at 30, buried as they would have been under deadlines and mortgages and 1,000 louder demands on your attention. Now, with the noise turned down, they don't just register. They land. They stay with you for the rest of the day, sometimes for years afterward, in a way that surprises even you. That lump in your throat over something small and ordinary, that's not you getting soft with age. That's you getting wise with it. And this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it quietly answers a question a lot of people your age carry without ever quite saying it out loud. Does life still have the capacity to feel meaningful this late in the story? The small things shift is your answer, and it's a generous one. Meaning was never only hiding in the big events to begin with. It was hiding in the ordinary ones the entire time, patiently waiting for you to finally have enough stillness to notice it. Which brings us naturally to something a little more practical, though no less emotional underneath. Reason number 4. You finally know what actually matters. Picture two versions of the same kind of decision, one you made at 30, and a similar one you might face today. At 30, maybe you agonized for weeks over what other people would think, whether the choice looked successful enough, whether it checked some invisible box you'd inherited from somewhere. Today, faced with something similar, you probably ask a much simpler, much more direct question instead. Does this actually make my life better? That shift isn't luck, and it isn't just vague wisdom that comes with age in some hand-wavy, unexplained sense. It's the direct, earned result of decades of real feedback. You have now lived through enough decisions, enough consequences, enough outcomes playing out fully in real life, that your priorities have been tested against reality hundreds and hundreds of times over. Things that seemed enormously important at 45, a certain job title, a certain size of house, what a distant acquaintance might think of your choices at a dinner party, have had 30 years or more to prove whether they actually mattered in the end, and for most people, most of that turned out quite plainly to be noise. Meanwhile, the things that actually held up under the full weight of time, a close friendship maintained across decades, an honest and difficult conversation finally had, quiet time spent with someone you genuinely love, those things kept proving their worth year after year, decade after decade, long after the noise had faded away. This is, essentially, wisdom in its most practical and least mystical form. Not some abstract philosophical achievement reserved for the enlightened few, but simply the accumulated data of a long life, finally sorted, at last, into what mattered and what never really did. Younger people are often making these same kinds of judgments essentially blind, without the decades of lived evidence you now quietly carry with you. You're not guessing anymore the way you once had to, because you watched it all play out, slowly, in real time across an entire lifetime. Maybe you spent years quietly measuring yourself against a neighbor's newer car, or a sibling's bigger house, or a colleague's faster rise up the ladder, certain that those things meant something important about how your own life was going. Decades later, you can look back and see, with total clarity, that none of it actually predicted who ended up happy, who ended up surrounded by people who loved them, who ended up at peace with themselves at the end of a long day. What predicted that every single time was something far quieter, showing up, being kind, staying close to the people who mattered. You didn't need a lecture to learn that. You needed the years, and now you have them. That clarity you feel now about what's genuinely worth your energy, that's not you giving up on ambition or settling for less. That's you finally spending your ambition correctly on the things that were always going to pay you back. And this is precisely why so many people in their 70s and 80s describe feeling more settled in their choices than they ever did during the busy, uncertain years of midlife, even when their circumstances are objectively smaller or quieter than they once were. It isn't resignation, and it was never about giving up. It's precision earned the hard way. You've simply stopped wasting your limited, precious time on things that were never actually going to pay you back, and started spending it on the handful of things that always reliably do. Ask most people in their 80s what they wish they'd spent less time worrying about, and you'll rarely hear about money or status or how the house looked to visitors. You'll hear about time not spent with the people who mattered, conversations left unsaid, small chances for closeness that felt too inconvenient to take at the time. You already know that now. That knowledge alone is worth more than most things you spent your 30s chasing. Now here's where I want to pause with you for just a second, because if you've stayed with me through these first 4, I think the next one is going to land a little differently. Reason number 5. You've already survived what once felt completely unsurvivable. Think about a specific moment from your life. Maybe a loss, maybe a serious illness, maybe a stretch of time you genuinely weren't sure you'd get through in one piece, and notice something simple but easy to overlook. You're here, right now, listening to this, telling that story, even silently to yourself, means you made it all the way to the other side of it. This matters far more than it might seem to at first glance. When you were in the middle of that hard chapter, your nervous system almost certainly treated it as an open, unresolved question. Will I actually survive this? Will I be okay on the other side? That uncertainty is genuinely exhausting to carry, and it's also, by simple necessity, theoretical while you're living inside it, because you hadn't lived the answer yet. But now, years or decades later, that question isn't theoretical for you anymore. You have direct, lived, undeniable proof that you can go through something truly devastating and come out the other side, changed, yes, but fundamentally still intact. This is a completely different kind of confidence than confidence based on optimism, or positive thinking, or wishful reassurance from someone else. This is confidence based on hard evidence, evidence you gathered yourself the hard way. Researchers who study resilience specifically in older adults have found something genuinely striking and consistent across many studies. People who have weathered real hardship earlier in life often show measurably more emotional steadiness later on, not less, because they're no longer facing new difficulties with a blank, untested track record behind them. They're facing new challenges with a long, thoroughly proven history of having gotten through hard things before, more than once. That history becomes a kind of quiet ballast underneath everything else you do. A felt sense, even in genuinely difficult moments, That this too is something you have the demonstrated capacity to survive because you already have. More than once. Sometimes far more than once. Maybe it was the year you lost someone you thought you couldn't live without, and somehow, impossibly, you kept getting up every morning anyway. Maybe it was an illness that frightened you more than you ever told anyone, or a period of financial hardship that kept you awake at night for months on end. Whatever it was, you are living proof right now today that it didn't end you. That's not a small thing to carry into whatever comes next. It's one of the most valuable things a long life gives you, and it's yours, earned the hard way, and nobody can take it from you now. That unexpected calm you sometimes feel in the middle of a hard moment now, the one that surprises even you, that's not numbness setting in with age. That's earned trust in yourself finally paying off. If you're still with me right now, I want you to notice something simple about yourself in this exact moment, listening to this. The fact that you're still curious enough, still open enough, still present enough to sit with these ideas for this long on an ordinary day like today, that itself is part of what we've been talking about this whole time. Let's keep going together because the next few reasons go even a little deeper than the ones we've covered so far. Reason number 6. Your relationships become more honest. Have you noticed yourself quietly pulling away, even slightly, from certain relationships that used to take up so much of your energy? The ones built more on obligation, on habit, on we've always kept in touch, than on any real, felt connection? And at the same time, have you noticed yourself leaning in harder, more deliberately, toward the small handful of people who actually, truly see you? This isn't coldness setting in with age, and it isn't a sign of anything going wrong. It's discernment, and it comes from a very specific, very human place. You simply have less time left to spend on relationships that don't nourish you in return, and some part of your emotional system already knows this, even before you've said it out loud to yourself. Researchers who study social relationships across the full lifespan have found a consistent and genuinely fascinating pattern. As people age, their overall social circles tend to shrink in size, but the emotional quality of the relationships that remain tends to steadily rise. This isn't because older people gradually become less capable of connection, as some tired stereotype might suggest. It's because they become more selective, more deliberate about exactly where they invest that connection, and that selectivity is not a symptom of loneliness creeping in. Very often, it's precisely the opposite of that. It's the direct result of finally having enough self-knowledge to recognize which relationships genuinely give you energy and which ones quietly, steadily drain it, something that's far harder to see clearly at 25 or 35, when almost every relationship in your life still feels urgently necessary to maintain, no matter the cost. By the time you reach your 70s, you've had decades and decades of real data on exactly who shows up for you and who consistently doesn't, who genuinely listens and who only performs the act of listening, who makes you feel more fully like yourself in their presence and who quietly makes you shrink a little every time you're together. And so your circle narrows, not because you have less love or warmth left to give the world, but because you've finally, patiently learned exactly where that love actually belongs. Maybe there's an old colleague you exchange a card with every December out of habit, and a conversation with them still feels the same as it did 30 years ago. Pleasant but strangely thin, as though you're both reading from a script. And maybe there's a sister or an old friend, or even a neighbor you only met 5 years ago, where a single phone call leaves you feeling more understood than an entire evening with people you've known far longer. That contrast isn't confusing anymore, the way it might have been once. You understand now, in a way you didn't at 40, that closeness was never really about how long you've known someone. It was always about how fully you could be yourself in front of them. That instinct to simplify who gets your time and attention now, that's not you becoming distant or withdrawn. That's you finally protecting what's genuinely precious to you. And here's the quiet, satisfying payoff of that hard-won discernment. The relationships that remain in your life tend to feel deeper, richer, not thinner or emptier. Adult children who once got polite, surface-level conversation from you now get honest conversation instead. Old friends who once got brief, obligatory catch-ups now get real vulnerability, real presence, real listening in return. The narrowing you feel isn't a loss of connection at all, whatever it might look like from the outside. It's connection, finally concentrated exactly where it always belonged. There's something else happening alongside that new honesty, something that touches almost every part of how you experience your days now, quietly, underneath the surface. Reason number 7. You feel your emotions more fully now, without the old shame that used to come attached to them. Have you cried more easily lately at things that catch you off guard? A piece of music from decades ago, an old photograph pulled out of a drawer, a small kind gesture from a total stranger, in a way that might have genuinely embarrassed you 30 or 40 years ago. And instead of quickly pushing it back down the way you once might have, almost automatically, have you noticed yourself simply letting it happen instead? There's a real, well-documented reason for this shift. For most of adulthood, especially for people raised in generations where emotional restraint was openly taught and quietly rewarded as a form of strength, a genuinely enormous amount of daily energy goes into carefully managing exactly how emotions appear on the outside, particularly in front of other people, colleagues, even family. That constant management is exhausting, even when it's completely invisible to everyone around you, even when you've never once thought of it in those terms. But somewhere in later life, for many people, that management starts to relax gradually, and it relaxes for a genuinely good and understandable reason. The perceived stakes of showing real emotion feel meaningfully lower now than they once did. You're not worried anymore that a moment of tears will look unprofessional in front of a boss, or unmanly in front of colleagues, or simply too much in front of people you're still actively trying to impress. Those particular audiences, as we talked about earlier in this video, have largely quietly stepped away from the stage of your life by now. What's left standing there instead is just you and your actual feelings without the old performance layered carefully on top of them anymore. There's an old saying that captures this better than almost anything I could add to it myself. The soul that has been through the fire fears the flame less and feels its warmth more. That's really genuinely what's happening here underneath everything else. You're not becoming more fragile with age, whatever it might look like on the surface. You're becoming less guarded instead, and those two things, fragility and openness, are very different from each other, even though they often get confused for one another by people watching from the outside. Full emotional expression later in life isn't a crack forming in the armor. Very often, it's simply what's left standing after the armor is finally, gently, no longer needed for protection. Maybe it happens when an old song comes on the radio unexpectedly, one that was playing during some long-forgotten summer, and suddenly your eyes are wet before you've even consciously registered why. Or maybe it's a photograph of someone no longer here, glanced at while looking for something else entirely in a drawer, and the feeling arrives before you've had any chance to brace for it. Decades ago, you might have blinked it back quickly, glanced around to see if anyone noticed, changed the subject in your own mind. Now, you let it move through you instead, and something in that letting through feels less like falling apart and more like finally being whole. That tear that comes faster now than it used to, the one that sometimes still catches you by surprise. That's not weakness quietly returning after all these years. That's a wall coming down that never really needed to be there in the first place. If any of this is landing for you right now, if you recognize even a little of this softening happening somewhere in yourself, I want you to know that it's one of the most quietly beautiful, most underappreciated parts of growing older, and almost nobody ever puts it into words for you because it doesn't announce itself loudly the way other changes do. It simply, slowly, gently becomes true, one ordinary day at a time. Reason number 8. You understand impermanence in your bones now, not just as an idea you learned somewhere along the way. You've probably known intellectually, since you were quite young, that nothing in this life lasts forever. That's not exactly a new or startling piece of information to anyone who's lived a while. But there's a real, felt difference between knowing that as an abstract idea, filed away somewhere in the back of your mind, and knowing it the way you know it now, in your body, in the way you hug someone goodbye a little longer than you used to at the end of a visit, in the way an ordinary Sunday dinner with people you love suddenly feels like something worth quietly holding on to. This is one of the most widely misunderstood parts of growing older, because from the outside, looking in, it can sometimes look like an unhealthy preoccupation with loss, or an overly gloomy fixation on endings. From the inside, though, for most people who actually live it, it's almost exactly the opposite of that. When an awareness of impermanence gradually moves from being an abstract fact you technically know into a felt, deeply lived truth you carry with you day to day, something meaningful changes in how you love the people and the moments still standing right in front of you. You stop taking the merely ordinary for granted, because you've now watched enough ordinary, unremarkable things. A long marriage, a career that once defined your days, a body that once moved through the world without you ever once having to think about it, quietly become extraordinary in hindsight, once they were gone or changed or simply couldn't be counted on the way they used to be. This isn't morbid in the least, despite how it might sound described this way. It's actually the direct opposite of morbid. A genuine, integrated awareness of impermanence, when it's fully absorbed rather than anxiously feared, tends to consistently sharpen appreciation rather than dull it or drag it down. It's the meaningful difference between someone who has never really stopped to think about losing something, and so simply takes it for granted without a second thought, and someone who has genuinely, deeply understood in their bones that this particular Tuesday dinner, this particular unhurried phone call, this particular ordinary sunset outside the kitchen window, will never happen again in exactly this way, and so they show up for it differently on purpose. More fully, with fewer distractions pulling at their attention and far more genuine attention actually given. That deepened, quieter attention isn't a symptom of fear operating underneath the surface. It's the direct fruit of finally, completely understanding what your time here actually truly is. It might show up in something as small as standing at the front door a beat longer than necessary, watching a car pull out of the driveway until it's fully out of sight, instead of turning back inside the moment the goodbye is technically finished. Or it might show up as calling someone just to hear their voice with no particular reason, no news to share, simply because you can, and because some quiet part of you no longer assumes that later is guaranteed the way it once felt like it was. That's not anxiety dressed up as affection. That's affection, finally given the full attention it always deserved. That instinct you now have to hold on just a little longer, to notice a little harder than you used to, that's not fear of losing the people and things you love. That's you finally knowing exactly how to keep them, in the only way anything in this life can genuinely be kept. By being fully, completely present while you still have it. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from that understanding, once you stop fighting it. And this brings us, quite naturally, to something that ties every single one of these reasons together. Something that might honestly be the deepest, most quietly important shift of all. Reason number 9, the final one for today. You are finally becoming the person you always had inside you. Think back for a moment to who you were at 20. Not the specific choices you made or the various roles you ended up playing over the decades that followed, but the actual person underneath all of that. The one with certain instincts, certain core values, a certain particular way of seeing and experiencing the world that quietly got buried, sometimes for decades at a stretch, under obligations, under other people's expectations, under the sheer, relentless busyness of building an entire life from the ground up. Here's what's genuinely remarkable about this later stage of life, something a psychologist named Erik Erikson spent much of his long career carefully studying. In the final stage of a human life, the central psychological task isn't decline at all, despite what our culture often quietly implies. It's integration. It's the slow, patient, deeply personal work of looking back over the entire, sprawling, wonderfully messy story of your life. Every choice you made and every one you didn't, every mistake, every hard-won triumph, every completely ordinary Tuesday that somehow added up to something, and gently weaving all of it into a single coherent narrative that genuinely makes sense as yours, as belonging distinctly to you. When that quiet work of integration goes well, it tends to produce something Erikson called ego integrity. A genuine, settled sense of wholeness, a felt conviction that despite everything that happened along the way, this particular life, exactly as it unfolded, was worth fully living, and that you, exactly as you are right now, sitting here today, are someone genuinely worth being. This process isn't automatic, and it certainly isn't always easy or comfortable to sit with. But it is available to you right now in this exact stage of life in a way it simply, honestly wasn't available to you at 30 or 40, because back then you hadn't yet lived enough of the story to be able to see its whole shape from a distance. All those earlier shifts we've walked through together today, noticing time differently, dropping the old performance, feeling small things more fully, finally knowing what genuinely matters, learning to trust your own hard-earned resilience, protecting your real relationships more carefully, feeling things without the old shame attached, holding impermanence gently instead of fearfully. All of it has quietly, steadily been building toward this one thing, toward becoming, finally, undeniably, completely yourself in full at last. Maybe there was a version of you at 20 who loved to sing or paint or write letters late into the night, and that version got quietly set aside for 40 years while you raised a family, built a career, kept a household running. It's not unusual in your 70s or 80s to find yourself picking that thread back up, almost without deciding to, humming again, sketching again, writing again. Not because you have something to prove to anyone, but because there's finally room and finally time and finally permission you no longer need to ask anyone else for. That isn't a hobby filling empty hours. That's a part of you that was always there, simply waiting its turn. That growing sense that you're more genuinely you now than you've ever been at any earlier point in your life. That's not nostalgia for who you used to be, looking backward with longing. That's arrival looking forward at last. And once you start seeing it this way, life after 70 stops looking like some kind of quiet ending being slowly, reluctantly approached, 1 year at a time. It starts looking like something else entirely instead. The one part of the whole story where everything you've ever lived through finally, genuinely gets the chance to make sense all at once, as a single, complete, and quietly remarkable whole. So let's go back, together, to exactly where we started this conversation. That quiet moment with the cold coffee, the light moving slowly through the window, the sudden softening you didn't ask for and didn't quite expect. Now you know what that moment actually was underneath the surface of it. It wasn't confusion, and it wasn't some early sign of decline you needed to worry about. It was time itself finally slowing down just enough for you to fully catch it, maybe for the first time in years. It was the old performance quietly ending, and the real you, the one who'd been there patiently all along, finally stepping forward into the light. It was decades of hard-won, hard-lived evidence slowly turning into trust, into genuine clarity, into a kind of deep honesty with yourself that simply takes an entire lifetime to earn, and can't be rushed or shortcut at any earlier age. If any part of what we've talked about today felt true to you, felt like it named something you've quietly carried for years without quite having the words for it, if you recognized even one of these 9 shifts somewhere in your own life, I would genuinely love for you to stay a little longer around here with us. This channel exists for exactly this purpose. To put honest words to the quiet, often completely unspoken parts of growing older, the parts almost nobody warns you about, not because they're frightening, but because, as it turns out, they were never warnings to begin with. They were gifts all along, simply waiting for you to notice them. Maybe you came into this video expecting the usual conversation about what gets harder after 70. And it does, in real and undeniable ways, and nothing here is meant to pretend otherwise. But I hope what you're leaving with instead is a slightly fuller picture, one with room in it for both truths at once. That this stage of life asks real things of you, and that it also quietly hands you things no earlier stage ever could, a kind of attention, a kind of honesty, a kind of wholeness that simply takes this many years to grow into. If that's something you think you'd like more of in your life, I hope you'll consider subscribing, not because a video is asking you to, but because I genuinely believe there's more here that might feel like it was written just for you specifically at exactly this stage of your life. Thank you, sincerely, for spending this time with me today, out of everything else you could have chosen to do with it. Wherever you happen to be sitting right now, however this particular season of your life happens to feel from the inside, I hope, more than anything else I could say, that you know it's not just still meaningful. In some quiet, hard-earned, deeply personal way, it might genuinely be the most meaningful chapter your life has ever had.